Hey guys, it's Michael Lennox. Today I wanted to talk about MIG welding versus stick welding. In light of the popularity of my last video about this topic, I thought I'd make a more detailed explanation, and I have a list of points that I'm going to talk about. Now, I do realize that this isn't a perfect comparison because this is a 160 amp stick welder and this is a 200 amp MIG welder, but the same number of amps will get you further with stick, so I do think this is a fair comparison. First comparison is cost. Now, if you're looking at getting your first welder, price is probably the most important factor that you're looking at. Now, it doesn't matter about the specific numbers here, but as a general rule, a MIG welder will cost about twice as much as a stick welder, and that's before you add things like gas and all the other accessories that come with MIG. On to the second point, weight. Now, just to make this simple, I'm not going to include the weight of the leads, but MIG and stick leads are about the same. So, with the scale zeroed out, we'll put the stick welder on and we can see that it's about 4 kilograms. The larger size box of stick welding electrodes is around 5 kilograms, making the whole package around 10 kilograms. Now, it's going to be difficult to get my MIG welder on the scale, but I'll try to. We can see that it is around 40 kilograms. So we can clearly see that the stick welder weighs far less than the MIG welder. Now, that's the weight before shielding gas. I'm going to put on this bottle and we'll see how heavy it becomes. So we can see that the scale jumps up to about 36 kilograms. So with the stick welder coming out to around 10 kilograms and the MIG welder coming around to about 75, we can clearly tell that stick welding is superior in this round. On to round 3, complexity. Now, when you stick weld, you have what's called a stinger. And this pretty much always goes into the positive terminal on your machine. And the stick welding electrode goes into the stinger. Once you have that down, the only adjustment you need to make is the amperage on the machine, which typically is in a very small range. Once you buy a package of stick welding electrodes, it'll tell you what amperage is required on them. And it's just a matter of turning the dial on your machine until it reaches that, and then you can start welding. However, on a MIG welding machine, just on the basic settings, you have to adjust both wire feed speed and voltage. And if you don't get that ratio essentially perfectly correct, you aren't going to have a weld that functions properly. Getting your settings right with MIG is far more frustrating than stick, and it takes a skilled eye and hand to be able to tell if the settings are right. If you're thinking, Michael, well, I'm just going to look at a preset chart online and then I won't have to go through the struggle of testing out my machine. Well, sadly to inform you, the thickness of material that you weld with MIG welding drastically changes the settings you're going to need. It's not really a case of just checking a chart online, and you do need a reasonable amount of skill to figure out the voltage to wire feed speed ratio. With stick welding, however, the thickness of material doesn't really change the amperage you need. It's all about the size of the rod. And instead of a stick welding stinger, you have something called a MIG welding gun, which is made of far more parts. A stinger has one part, whereas a MIG gun has several. So to start off, you have both a nozzle and an insulator. So this is a cheaper gun. It just has a nozzle and an insulator built in one, but they're separate parts typically. And you have a contact tip that's inside. These need replacing constantly. Then you have all the other parts like the gas diffuser. If you have a problem when you're MIG welding, it could be any one of these parts that's acting up. These guns also fail all the time, but I've never seen a stinger fail. On top of this, when you MIG weld, you need to make sure that your gas flow settings are just right, otherwise it could cause an issue. Now, with all of these things that need to be adjusted perfectly right, you really have no idea what is causing it. So putting a MIG welder in the hands of someone who has no experience with these kind of things, they will be incredibly lost. This is when you see people who have been welding for years and they still have no idea how to get a good weld. Once again, stick welding just has one dial to adjust the amperage. Get that reasonably close and you're golden. Now, onto ease of use, essentially how easy it is to learn how to weld with these different processes. So this is probably the most common reason I see why people recommend MIG. So many people say that MIG welding is just as easy as using a hot glue gun or something like that. When you MIG weld, you need to have a constant angle and maintain a constant distance above the work. Keep in mind that everything when you weld is incredibly hot, so you have to keep your hands in the right position. And to get the correct size of weld, you need to actually be looking with your eyes to see what size the puddle is, which takes quite a bit of practice. So without putting a MIG gun in your hands, I can tell you that MIG welding isn't easy, but what really matters is if it's easy compared to stick, and I'll discuss that now. Now with stick welding, instead of having a gun, you have a rod, and instead of pressing a trigger that feeds the wire for you, you have to manually feed the electrode in. So as you weld along, it shrinks the electrode. So you have to be in a position that allows you to pull your hand in as you come down. The way to get around this is just to prop on something. The most common way of doing this is just putting your elbow on something and then grabbing the sting with your other hand. This way you're stable as you feed in. So stick welding might require a little bit more focus than MIG welding. But because you don't have the nozzle getting in the way and just a bare exposed electrode, it makes it way easier to see the puddle and how the weld is going to look. So I'd say this round is a tie. The automatic feeding of the MIG does make it a little bit easier, but the nozzle does get in the way, so it makes it harder to see. On to versatility. With a MIG gun, you're really limited to steel. You can weld aluminium, but by that point you're almost going to double the cost of what your entire setup costs. So it really isn't an option. With stick though, your options are far greater. You can weld cast iron, you can weld nickel alloys, you can do very crude aluminium welding, you can hard face things. It's the options of what you can do with stick welding just are far greater than MIG. None of these even come close to TIG welding in terms of material selection, but you get the idea. Number 6, tight spaces. Now, my MIG gun has a much smaller nozzle than you'll see on many MIG welders on the market. But we can all agree that a stick welding electrode is far smaller than a MIG welding nozzle. This allows you to get in far tighter spaces. This is apparent in all industries, and stick welding is still used in places that exclusively do MIG just because it can fit into really tight spaces. If you're working on something automotive where there's stuff crammed everywhere, stick might be your only option. Number 7, cleanliness of materials. MIG welding requires a lot cleaner material to weld on than stick does. Even though you might be able to lay down an alright bead on top of some rusted material or something that has mill scale on it, the penetration of weld will be drastically reduced. Stick welding, however, is much less fussy, and you can weld in conditions that are far less clean. It really doesn't care as much about rust or mill scale. And in fact, 6010 or 6011, aka cellulose stick welding rods can really weld through anything. On top of this, cellulose rods like 6010 and 6011 can burn through paint, which is just ridiculous. You won't get as strong of a weld as if you clean it off, but it still can be done. So for situations where you can't clean the rust off something, stick might be your only option. As a general rule, you can't MIG weld outside, and it really isn't a good idea to stick weld inside. So I bet most of you watching don't really have a large workshop or a fancy air filtration device. So based on that, I can tell you that you're gonna have to weld outside. MIG welding cannot be done outside under most conditions. Even a slight breeze will blow away the shielding gas, which leaves your weld bare. Now, my final point, noise. Now, I haven't heard anyone on YouTube talking about this, but the sound of the wire creating the arc and short-circuiting into the material is incredibly loud. I'll show you now. Now, I don't know how well that came on camera, but that sound was incredibly loud. In fact, it was pretty uncomfortable making that really short weld. For this reason, I always wear hearing protection when I weld. With stick welding, however, because the electrode is much larger, its velocity into the puddle is much slower. meaning that there really isn't much noise to the arc at all, and you can tolerate not wearing hearing protection. In fact, if you're stick welding with an AC transformer, the loudest part of the welding will be the machine. Even if you put in hearing protection in, the noise can still be a hassle, especially if you live in a sort of more residential area. So I hope that video gave you an insight on why I think stick welding is a better option if you're just starting out than MIG welding is. Now, that's not to say that MIG welding doesn't have a place, because it does, but in my opinion, MIG welding is not suited to the hobbyist home. With that said, thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate you watching. Good luck with your welding journeys. God bless. Please subscribe to the channel, like the video. Maybe check out some other of my videos. Thanks for watching, guys. See you.